VFR cross-country flight planning from start to end. Let's get right to it. Say we're planning a flight from Whidbey Island to Sekou in the Seattle area. The first thing we need to consider for the flight planning is the route itself. Generally, a direct line between the departing airport and arrival airport is the preferred method. But in many cases, such as this one, it's really not recommended, be it because of special use airspace, obstacles, or dangers. In our case, a direct route would have us fly over way too much water. If you're flying a multi-engine aircraft, this would not be an issue. But in this flight, we will be using a single engine, for example, a Cessna 172. In the interest of safety, we decide we will be flying first to Jefferson County International Airport, and then we will continue our flight straight to Sekou. The first thing we need to do is to align our plotter with the Whidbey and the Jefferson Airport and draw our first course line as shown. We do the same for our second and final line, aligning the plotter with the Jefferson and Sekou airports. Next, let's find some visual checkpoints to help us make sure we don't get lost. Generally, you want these checkpoints to be between 10 and 15 nautical miles apart, but it really all depends on the aircraft you are flying. In our case, 10-15 miles is just fine, but if you're flying a much faster aircraft such as an SR-22, then you would probably want to double those distances. I will pick Jefferson as the first checkpoint. In reality, the top of the climb will be the first one, and that should be around Lupien Airport. We'll see that later. My next checkpoint will be Valley Airport, followed by Fairchild Airport, and so far the checkpoints have been picked because they're easy to recognize. The next two will not be that easy, but we know that as long as we follow the southern coastline, we won't be getting lost. Let's pick this river as a checkpoint, and for the last one, choose Pillar Point. Now let's calculate the distances of our various checkpoints. We start by realigning the plotter with our first two airports, placing the zero distance to make our calculations convenient. And we can see that the total distance to our first checkpoint is 19 nautical miles. Now we do the same for the second line, calculating the distances one by one. Next is the true course calculation. For this, we will again be using the plotter. We align it with the first drawn line and slide the center until it hits a latitude line. If we follow that latitude line to the headings, we can see that it intersects four numbers, 199, 19, 291, and finally 111. Which do we pick? Well, let's not complicate our lives explaining which number to pick based on latitude, longitude, and other facts. Let's just use logic instead. The flight from Whidbey to Jefferson is very close to a south heading, so we're going to pick 199 as it is the closest to 180 of the four numbers. And that is our course for the first leg. We repeat the process for the second leg, this time placing the center of the plotter on a longitude line. Again, we find four numbers, 193, 13, 283, and 103. Using the same logic as before, we will pick 283, as it is the closest to west. By the way, all this time we have been placing the numbers we found on our flight plan log. And let's take a peek at that now. And here's your typical navlog portion of your flight plan, where we'll be inserting all of the numbers we found before and doing our calculations. By the way, if you do not have access to a navlog, you can find plenty online, including this one, which is on one of our websites. Just click the link on the description, print it out, or save it, and voila, you have your own flight log. Anyway, on the navlog, let's start with the data we found previously, commencing with the checkpoints. Now, if you remember what I said earlier, we need to add a checkpoint called top of climb, which is the point where we reach our cruising altitude. Today we checked the winds, and they were favorable at 3,000 feet, as we would have a tailwind for the entire trip. So we actually picked 3,000 feet for cruising altitude. The altitude is fine even though we're flying west, which would require uneven altitude plus 500 feet by regulations. But the regulations also state that up to 3,000 feet above the ground, you can pick any altitude you wish. Now, without getting into any POH data, Pilot Operating Handbook data, to figure out time and distance, we know that our airplane, let's say, climbs at about 90 knots and 700 feet per minute. That's usually a newer 172. So to climb to 3,000 feet, it's going to take about 4.5 minutes. Actually 4.28 minutes, but in the name of safety, it's always better to average the numbers towards a lesser performance. Now, at 90 knots, we're traveling 1.5 miles per minute. 60 miles an hour is 1 mile per minute. 90 is 1.5 times 60, so 1.5 miles per minute. So if we multiply that by 4.5 minutes, we come out with approximately 7 miles. Now, let's finish placing all of our checkpoints. Next, let's input our course. We found out 199 degrees for the first 2 checkpoints, followed by 283 degrees for the rest. Next, our altitude, which we said was going to be 3,000 feet for the entire route. Now the wind, which again we checked the weather, and let's say today it was 030 at 14 knots for the entire route. And the temperature is a standard 9 degrees. From the POH we found the calibrated airspeed was going to be 110, which using the flight computer would register a true airspeed of about 115 knots given the 3,000 feet altitude and the temperature of 9 degrees. If you're not familiar with these calculations, watch our other linked videos which will show you how to use the flight computer, or just keep watching as we will be actually using it a little bit next. To find the wind correction angle, we will need to use the flight computer. Again, for detailed explanations on how to use the E6B, watch our E6B video. First, we align the center of the plotter with the 100 mark, just to make the process easier. Then, we will just follow the instructions on the top of the flight computer. We set the wind direction of 030 under the true index as shown. Next, we mark the wind velocity of 14 knots up from the center. Then we place the true course of 199 under the true index. Finally, we slide the wind velocity mark we made earlier to the true airspeed line, the task line of 115 knots. And now, finally, we can read the ground speed of 128 knots under the center and the wind correction angle of 1 degree left between the center line and the wind velocity mark. So our ground speed is going to be 128 knots, and our true course is 198, because as we can see from the E6B legend, L has a minus in front of it, meaning we subtract a left value and add a right one. If you do the same for the second leg of the flight, you will find a ground speed of 118 knots and a true course of about 290. Now let's keep looking to the right of the flight log to correct for the variation line. If we look back at the chart, we can see that the variation line is 19 degrees east. So we should subtract 19 from our true course to obtain a true heading of 179 for the first leg and 271 for the second leg. Because east is least, so you subtract it, and west is best. Just remember that. You subtract east, you add west variation. Finally, for the magnetic course, you will need to check the deviation card mounted onto the compass in the airplane. If we check this one, we can see that for a heading of 179, we should steer about 182, because we would steer 183 for a heading of 180. And for the second leg, we will steer 270, as the correction for 270 is 269. So we're going to take 1 out of 271. Moving to the left of the flight log, we can add the distances between our checkpoints that we found earlier. 7 for the top of climb, 12, 15, and so on. Next is our ground speed, which we found earlier to be 128 knots for the first leg and 118 for the second. At this point, we're going back to the E6B for the rest of our calculations on the next slide. For the final calculations on our nav log, we will need to flip the E6B to the other side. Again, for a detailed explanation on calculating times, watch our E6B video, as we will be only showing you the motions on this video without a thorough explanation on the details. Like we did for the wind calculations before, all you really need to do is look at the legend for the speed and time calculations. The legend tells you to place the black arrowhead on the ground speed. So let's do that and align the black arrowhead with 128 knots for the first leg and later 118 for the second. The speeds we previously found. After aligning the arrowhead with 128, on the outer ring we will read the distances. On the middle ring, the time in minutes, and on the inner ring the time in hours. If the distance was very long, we would look at the hours. Now we look for 12 on the outer ring, which is the first distance, and we find 5.5 minutes on the middle ring. We said before we're going to round to the worst case scenario, so let's input 6 instead of 5.5. By the way, before we go any further, keep in mind that if you're actually flying in the airplane, pulling out the flight computer, spinning the dials around, and reading the results might not be the best thing to do. So, looking for an easy way out? Well, here's our easy solution. 120 knots means we travel 2 nautical miles per minute. 60 seconds in a minute, 120, twice that, and so on. So 10 miles equals 5 minutes. At 120 knots, we can pretty much divide the distances by 2 to obtain our time. Let me point out that both of our speeds, 128 and 118, are very close to the 120 knot mark. So to obtain the times, we could just divide all the distances by 2 and round the numbers up for safety again. Doing so would obtain our times of 6, which we already found, 8, 6, 7, 6, and again finally 4. But let's go ahead and calculate them with A6B anyway. Okay, so if we now move the arrowhead on the 118 knot mark and check the outer ring for the distance of 15, we'll find 8 minutes. On the middle ring, the same number we found earlier. Let's keep going. Our next distance is 11, which comes up to 5.6, rounded up to 6. And again, keep using the same system to fill out the rest of the log and all of our times, including the final one for a total time of 42 minutes after we also included the time for the top of climb. Finally, the fuel, and we're done. Again, we read the legend to find that we need to place the arrowhead on gallons per hour consumption of the airplane. Checking the POH, we found that under these conditions, the airplane consumption will be 7.5 gallons per hour. So we slide the arrowhead on 7.5. Then, on the inside, we read the time spent, and on the outside, the fuel burned. So 6 minutes will be 0.75 gallons, so let's say 0.8. 8 minutes will be 1 gallon, and so on, to find a total fuel consumption of 5.3 gallons. But let's keep in mind that we also need to add the top of climb, taxi, run-up, and everything. So let's add 2 gallons to the whole number, and our final fuel consumption is 7.3 gallons. The rest of the navlog is just small details like putting in frequencies and stuff that you don't really need to calculate. You will just need to check your VFR chart and maybe AFD to fill out the rest of the details. But the calculations are done.